Hello, AP Euro students. I'm back, this time hiding in my bedroom, but I have to get away from my family for a little bit so I can make this video on the rise of Hitler and Nazi Germany between World War I and World War II. And something struck me as I was about to make this, and I guess I'd never really paid attention to the name of the chapter before. I always called it the Interwar Years chapter. But take a look at it. It's called The Futile Search for Stability. And that's an interesting way to look at it. European countries were looking for some sense of stability, which is why they went to, dictators like Hitler and Mussolini and Stalin. But there would be no stability. In fact, if anything, it made the chance of finding stability even worse. There was like this futile and fruitless attempt to try to find meaningfulness and stability in a continent, in a country that was not set up for it at that time. There were still major lessons to be learned that apparently were not learned after World War One. So it's going to have to be learned the hard way after World War Two. And perhaps this is one of the biggest travesties when we look at the 20th century. So we're going to talk today about the rise of Hitler, how he exactly came to power, which is surprising because for somebody who was as violent and tyrannical and power hungry as him, it's important to note that he largely rose to power because he was chosen. He was elected, and he was actually really quite popular with the people of Germany. I'm not saying everyone loved him, and certainly he did some pretty shady things to rise to power as well. He certainly was not honest. He certainly intimidated and used terror tactics to rise to power as well. And he used a lot of thuggery and sort of like these backdoor deals. But that being said, he's had a very popular base. So when we are done with this, I'm going to ask you to go to the chapter 26 reading packet, which you'll find down here. And once you have downloaded it, you'll find it looks something like this. And you'll find selections from Mein Kampf, which is Hitler's autobiography, as well as a Nazi propaganda pamphlet by Joseph Goebbels, who was in charge of all of Hitler's propaganda in Nazi Germany. There are other readings as well, but those are the ones I would like for you guys to mainly focus on. So let's start talking about how Hitler comes to power in this situation and how he's able to get away with it. So it's important to remember that after World War I, Germany had transformed into a republic, and this was called the Weimar Republic. This republic, this form of government in Germany, was very unpopular for many reasons. For one, Germany was a complete mess. Politically and economically, psychologically, Germany was traumatized, humiliated, and economically, spiritually broken after World War I. And this government was not equipped to handle that. It was trying to be a liberal republic, but it could not resolve the problems. For one, the hero, the military hero Paul von Hindenburg, who was very popular during World War I, he's elected president of Germany. He's kind of old at this point, and many people think that he's trying to please too many different factions in Germany. He's also trying to essentially run a republic, and he doesn't really know how. And so there's a lot of voting and there's a lot of discussion and there's a lot of arguing that goes on. And meanwhile, people in Germany are starving. The veterans have no jobs. There is nowhere for these crippled veterans to go. And Germany is just rampant with so many problems at this point. It's probably no surprise that the Republic was not well run. Paul von Hindenburg, who was the president of Germany at the time, he was actually a conservative monarchist. He didn't really care for the idea of a republic anyway. So it's no surprise he probably didn't really know what running a republic should have looked like, I suppose. Although it's not entirely his fault, of course. Germany had a lot of problems, and a brand new republic in a country that had always been a monarchy up to this point is simply not going to be equipped to deal with these issues. So the Weimar is actually hated by both the left and the right. It's ineffective. It can't solve the economic or the political problems in Germany at this time. So how does Hitler come into this? Well, first of all, Hitler was not even German. He was actually Austrian. He was born in Vienna in 1889. And growing up in Vienna, he has actually said in his own autobiography that he had a very these were some very formative years for him, and that it was in Vienna that he really understood, um, you know, many of the things that he comes to later act on in his beliefs, like, for example, his anti Semitism, his sense of patriotism, the racism he felt, the sense of rejection. But it's also interesting to note that Hitler did not have a very ideal childhood growing up. So Hitler was born into a family that doesn't have a lot of money. He was a very bad student in school, was never really good at much. He didn't have a lot of friends, probably because he was a bit of a bully. And he ends up dropping out of school. He was also notoriously a mama's boy. He loved his mother very much. He hated his father. By all accounts, his father was actually really quite abusive, had beaten him and had neglected him. And so he had no real connection, to his father. In fact, if anything, he kind of hated his father growing up. And then his father died, and he was raised by his mom for the rest of his childhood. It's also interesting to note that Hitler's father was half Jewish. Hitler's father was actually the child of a German housemaid who had worked in the home of a wealthy Jewish family. And the son of that wealthy Jewish family had gotten her pregnant. They'd never gotten married. And so Hitler's father grew up, poor, a child out of wedlock, which was back in those days seen as very disgraceful. And probably took out a lot of his anger on his son, Hitler. For that reason, Hitler believed, this is one of the things that causes Hitler to have so much anti Semitism. And he sees Jewish men as predators who prey on innocent German women. So there are a lot of things that shape his anti Semitism. Growing up in Vienna in this time period is also one of them. The mayor of Vienna at the time was known for giving very anti Semitic speeches. Um, he moves to Munich in 1913 after he is rejected from a Vienna art school. He wanted to be an artist, as many of you probably know. Some of us have wondered many times what would have happened if Hitler had actually just been accepted into art school and become an artist instead. But he was not seen as a very talented artist. He only painted landscapes, he never painted people. So he was not seen as having any kind of unique or special talent in painting. So he gets rejected, but then in 1913 he moves to Munich, and then he enlists in the war in World War One, and he actually ends up serving for the German army rather than the Austrian army during World War One. And it was during that time that he really finds his calling. He's really bad at a lot of things, but he found out he was actually pretty good at war, at being a soldier. And when the war is over and Germany is humiliated, not Hitler is filled with rage, and he goes home to Munich and he joins up with this National Socialist Party, which would later be called the National Socialist German Workers' Party. Interestingly enough, it is mostly made up of unemployed German war veterans who are very angry and bitter about the way life has turned out for them. This National Socialist German Workers' Party starts off as a small right wing group, but they are large enough to actually gain their own police force called the SA, or the Stormtroopers, or the Storm Detachment. And they sort of are like the group's bodyguards, so to speak. And a lot of war veterans wanted to join them because, it was a job. It offered some form of employment. It didn't pay much, but it was better than doing nothing, and it gave people a chance to put on a uniform and earn a small wage. Also, they were angry and they were bitter, and this gave them an outlet. So in 1923, Hitler and some other members of this Nazi party, they actually tried to take over the government in a beer hall in Munich. This is called the famous failed Munich beer hall push. It literally took place in a beer hall, or like what would be a pub or a bar. And that's where many of these members of the Weimar Republic were. And he tried to blow it up. He tried to assassinate some of these leaders. Because some people backed out of it at the last minute, the whole plot fell apart. And Hitler was actually caught, and he was imprisoned. He was actually only given a 5-year sentence. And because the judges in his trial were actually sympathetic, many of them were right wing sympathizers who actually sort of understood where Hitler was coming from at the time. They gave him a very light sentence. I mean, can you imagine only getting 5 years of prison for trying to overthrow the government and assassinate your country's leadership? That would not happen today, I think. So while Hitler is in prison, though, he actually had a great time in jail because they were very lenient on him. He was allowed to receive visitors and see friends, and he was given all sorts of comforts in his prison cell. He was able to write his autobiography while sitting in prison, which is famously known as Mein Kampf. Mein Kampf is German for my struggle. Hitler saw himself as a victim, just like he thought Germany was a victim. You might be wondering, a victim of what? Well, according to Hitler, a victim of the Versailles Treaty, a victim of communism, and most of all, a victim of Jewish conspiracies to destroy Germany. In the book, he actually writes that Germans are the master Aryan race, that they are superior to all others in Europe. They have a right to take over land that rightfully belonged to them, particularly in Eastern Europe, or what was now at that time Russia. That the Germans needed living space, or Lebensraum as he calls it. And he also says that Jews are the natural enemy of the German people, that Jewish people had conspired against Germany to lose the war, to sign the humiliating Versailles Treaty, and that Germany would not be strong until the Jewish people were purged from Germany and then later all of Europe. His book actually becomes really popular, even though some people thought his ideas were kind of out there. No one actually thought anyone's ever gonna actually really kill all this entire race of people. So he was never really taken too seriously. A lot of people thought well, he's just a patriotic guy, but he says a lot of things that make sense, at the time to people, and but they never really took him that seriously, which is definitely a mistake. So here you see a picture of Adolf Hitler during one of his political rallies. And this is often at his rallies, you would see these ritualistic ceremonies, which would be a way to sort of bind all party members to his own person. And he would later make them all take an oath of loyalty to him, not to the state of Germany, but to him personally. So once he gets out of prison, he rejoins with the Nazi Party because miraculously they were still allowed to exist. And there he sees a need for a lawful takeover of power. If overthrowing the government by force is not going to be an option, he's going to have to work within the party itself. Now, this is the part that I always find really incredible about Nazi Germany. Can you guys imagine if right now there was a guy who tried to take over the government by assassinating the president of the United States? And 5 years in that, and then he gets out of prison, and 5 years later, he actually runs for office and wins. Like, this is the part that really goes to show you what kind of desperate situation Germany was in, that this sort of thing would even be possible. So he actually realizes that the German people are going to need to be organized under a concept called Führerprinzip, which means leadership principle. That basically means that you need a strong leader and everybody needs to listen to that leader. In other words, a dictator. By the time we get to 1929, only 6 years after Hitler's failed attempt in the beer hall in Munich, the Nazi Party had grown to 178,000 members. Now that's, pretty sizable. Many of the members were actually young German men. A lot of them considered themselves to be fierce German patriots or nationalists, German nationalists. They were not interested in democracy. As far as they were concerned, democracy didn't work. It had failed. They were more in favor of action, of showing off their muscles, their guns, beer hall brawls, and powerful speeches and rallies. When the Great Depression hits that same year, this actually makes it easier to get the middle and lower class support because the Nazi Party actually promised jobs and it promised, to make Germany great again. So this is going to, from this point on, almost a piece of cake for Hitler. By the time we get to 1930, the chancellor of Germany at the time, Chancellor Brüning, couldn't even get a functioning majority in the Reichstag. The Reichstag would be like the parliament of Germany at the time. So he had to rule by emergency decree. And by the time we get to this point, we really start to see this phenomenon that democracy was actually already dying. Hitler would certainly put the final nail in its coffin, but the situation in Germany was so desperate that the whole concept of democracy itself was already starting to die, was already starting to malfunction. They couldn't make it work. Then in the 1932 election, the Nazis are going to actually have quite a bit of success and win quite a few seats. They win the support of middle class voters at this time. The middle class saw the Nazi Party as a defense against communism, since the middle class was very much afraid of communism in Germany at this time, and the spread of communism from Russia was very real. In fact, Germany already had a communist revolt at the end of World War One. So by the time we get to 1932, 2 years later, the Nazis are, they're taking part in some serious political maneuvering. They've also grown, they've multiplied almost 4 times. They have about 800,000 members by this point. And they start to do some innovative electioneering techniques. Now, these are things we see even today in our own elections, like propaganda. They start to appeal to class interests. They say one thing to the poor, one thing to the middle class, one thing to the rich, but always appealing to their needs and desires and fears. This perhaps where this might be where a lot of mistrust of politicians comes from. Hitler also, by this point, realizes that elections don't matter. The Reichstag isn't even that important. The parliament doesn't matter because the government's just ruling by decree anyway. What this means is that the government, the president or the chancellor, they just say, this is an emergency, we don't have time to vote, and then they just decree something and it happens. And Hitler's like, I can do that. So the only group that was really opposed to Hitler at this time, to the Nazis, were the Social Democrats. Now that's interesting to note because the Nazis are known as National Socialists. The Social Democrats are also a form of socialist. Remember, I said in class, the term socialist kind of just became this label that could be construed by various groups to mean different things. So socialism means one thing to the Nazis. It means another thing to the Social Democrats. It means another thing to the conservative Republicans of Germany and state socialism. And it means it's something entirely different to the socialists of the USSR, the Soviet Union. It can sort of be this morph like jelly term that can take on almost any shape that the leaders want it to take on. That's why the term socialism can be so confusing now. But socialism does not necessarily equate with Nazism or Stalinism. Remember, it's a term that can be reinterpreted and reimagined and reinvented. However, while the Social Democrats were openly opposed to Hitler, the right wing elites of Germany at the time actually kind of liked him. Now, they didn't love him. They did think he was kind of nuts. There was something about Hitler, obviously, in his persona that they did not like. But they did see him as a strong leader who, at the very least, could protect Germany from a communist takeover because Hitler hated communists and he scapegoated them the whole time. But one mistake that these conservative right wing elites make about Hitler is they believe mistakenly that they can control him. They didn't realize that he was actually the one pulling all the strings. Hitler was a lot of things, but he was also politically very clever at this time. He was an opportunist. I have to say this about him. Hitler never had a plan. He never wrote out this blueprint, this step-by-step plan, like step 1, step 2, what he's going to do. He was an opportunist. He actually was very good at recognizing opportunities when they presented themselves to him, and then he seized those opportunities. So in a way, Hitler was sort of flying by the seat of his pants, winging it. But the situation was just so ripe in Germany for someone to come in and take over this way, and Hitler recognized it for what it was. So he's going to be the one that's going to be calling all the shots. Now, these conservative elites who liked Hitler who saw him as a strong leader who could at least protect Germany from communism, they pressure President Hindenburg, who by this point is a very old man. They pressured him to appoint Hitler the new chancellor. In other words, Hitler is second in command in Germany at this time. But 2 months later, Hitler's going to lay the foundation for a complete and total takeover. He has one of his closest officials and right hand man, it's a guy named Hermann Goring. And Hermann Goring believes that the Nazis are justified in using terror, legal Nazi terror. We've seen this before in history. Remember Robespierre, Lenin in the Soviet Union? They believe that sometimes terror is justified to get rid of your opponents. So he purges all of the non-Nazis in the German government. Now, something interesting happens a little bit later. On February 27, 1933, a fire breaks out in the building of the Reichstag, the government building of Germany. Allegedly, the story was reported that the fire was set by communists. However, whoever set the fire, and to be quite honest, no one really knows. There was never any evidence pointing to a particular person. This gives Hitler an excuse. He uses this story to claim that the government is under attack by communists, and so he pressures Hindenburg to issue Article 48. It's an important one. Article 48. This basically allows the government to rule by emergency decree only. In other words, they don't have to sit around and vote or appeal or anything. The chancellor and the president can do whatever they want. Since the chancellor and the president are surrounded by the Nazi party at this point, and the president, Hindenburg, is a very old man, and Hitler is basically calling the shots, the Nazis were allowed to do virtually whatever they wanted to do. The Reichstag then, under pressure, passes what's called the Enabling Act the very next month in March of 1933. This brings all institutions of Germany, government institutions, education, churches, you name it, all of them are brought under Nazi control, and the government can dispose of the Constitution and dispose of people's civil liberties because, according to them, they were under emergency rule. They also then open up concentration camps where they're going to put all of their political opponents. This literally means all suspected communists and socialists in Germany. They then also purge Jewish citizens of all their civil service jobs. This is one of the earlier attacks against the Jews in Germany. So Jews were no longer allowed to work within or for the government of Germany itself. So why are the Nazis so successful? I mean, right before our very eyes, we have watched as one step after another, the democracy of Germany died a very slow but very obvious death and gave way to the Nazis. Well, some people say, one of the major causes was the loss of faith in the Weimar Republic as being unable to do anything about Germany's problems, and the loss of faith in democracy itself. There was a slogan as well at this time that Germany must be awake. Germany awake, right? Germany has to wake up to the problems in Germany. And this is fueled by rampant German nationalism. By the time we get to 1933, only the army and the SA, remember them, the stormtroopers or the storm detachment, which are led by a guy named Ernst Röhm, are threats to Hitler. Interestingly enough, the stormtroopers were supposed to be the bodyguards of the Nazi Party. But Ernst Röhm was a member of the Nazi Party himself, and he did not like Hitler. He believed that Hitler was a threat to the civil liberties of the German people, and he was right about that, even though he was a Nazi. They just saw the role of the Nazi Party differently, Röhm and Hitler. And so Hitler has Röhm and his supporters in the SA, the stormtroopers, killed on the night of June 30th, 1934. This is known as the Night of the Long Knives. So he has now killed his opponents. He's gotten the support of much of the country at this point. And he's just about to get the support, he's about to become the sole ruler of Germany when he finally gets the support of the army, when he pressures Hindenburg to basically sign a law that would allow Hindenburg to be succeeded by Hitler after Hindenburg dies. Remember, he's an old man. And interestingly enough, shortly after, on August 2nd, Hindenburg died of supposed natural causes. Well, at this point, Hitler is now the sole ruler of Germany. Just like that, he did it. Step by step, right under the noses of the people, he chipped away at the civil liberties, at democracy, until it was all under his control. One of the ways that he kept the support of the people was by constantly having these rallies that were meant to be these mass public spectacles. It's interesting to note that he continues to have rallies even after he has won. This is perhaps meant to be a distraction away from other problems or other things to be afraid of in Germany, a place where he can continue to scapegoat the enemy, that what he considers the enemies of Germany, and to make the German people feel that they are on the rise, that they are making Germany great again. So now he starts to build up his Nazi state. And he calls this a total state because everything is under his control. The whole point is to create a unified Aryan racial state. He will later take over Austria, since he believes Austria and Germany should be one under one rule. Like I said, he continues to have these mass demonstrations and spectacles. They take on almost this religious fervor. His supporters almost saw him as, this godlike figure who could do no wrong. And Hitler would constantly talk about his enemies. Imagine if Hitler had a Twitter. He constantly talked about the people who were against him, the people who were against Germany, how he would overcome them and defeat them. By constantly talking about his enemies and making it seem like he had all these rivals, this actually makes Hitler seem more powerful than he really was. He also takes interest in economic control of the country. Now, this is not the same thing as communism, where in communism, the government controls the economy. That's not what he means. They don't take over the means of production like the communists do. He actually allowed for the private ownership of the means of production. So factories and railroads and all these things, they're still owned by private owners, private entrepreneurs and businessmen. Hitler famously said he doesn't care who owns the means of production so long as they recognize their master. That would be him. This also puts a lot of people to work, so there's a massive drop in unemployment. However, it is interesting to note that yes, there was a drop in unemployment, but the German people were working for very, very low wages at this time, and working very long hours. So, it's one thing to say that there's a drop in unemployment, but you have to look a little deeper than that and realize, okay, yeah, there's very little unemployment, but the people are making very little money and working very long hours. And it was almost as if it was a return back to the early 1800s of the Industrial Revolution days. Why are people able to go back to work in factories? Well, because he's going to start to rearm Germany. He builds an air force. He builds tanks. He builds guns. This specifically goes against the Versailles Treaty. He creates something called the Labor Front. Now, this is not the same thing as a labor union that is created by the workers themselves. That is really something more from the left wing. The Labor Front is a state-run union. In other words, a union run by the government for the government, and forces the workers to become part of this union. And this is really used to control the workers and make them submit to Nazi control. Again, not the same as a labor union that is formed by the laborers themselves. This is formed by the Nazi Party and the state. One of the things that this Labor Front does, though, it's really interesting to note, he wants to keep the workers happy. Happy workers are loyal workers. He wants to be seen as a benevolent leader, one who rewards his people for loyalty. So the Labor Front also sponsors leisure activities, like for workers who produced a certain amount of products, who met their quota, they would be rewarded, for example, with a vacation holiday in the mountains of Germany with their families, or they would be rewarded with something like a bicycle or something like that. So workers were rewarded for working hard, and this actually does keep a lot of people happy and it makes them loyal to the state. Um, he also then gets another one of his right hand men, one of his officials named Heinrich Himmler, to form what's called the Schutzstaffen, which is known as the SS. So the SS were his own personal paramilitary police force. They function by terror and ideology. These are the people who are the most, I guess you could say, brainwashed by the Nazi Party. They're a very violent group. They were originally start off as his secret police. They would spy on people, arrest anyone who was guilty of talking badly about the Nazi Party or the way things were going. They also were used as his criminal police, and they started to simply openly arrest people who they considered to be criminals, which of course meant Jewish people or sympathizers of Jewish people. Then they turned into execution squads. They literally just started going out to the street and shooting people indiscriminately later on. And then later on, he puts them in charge. Once the war is underway, the SS is put in charge of running the death camps during the Holocaust. Of course, this group, the SS, is very much indoctrinated and brainwashed into believing that they are going to further the Aryan race and, essentially hand the world over to the Aryan people. Churches and education are brought under Nazi control as well. The churches often replaced the crucifix with the sword and the Bible with Mein Kampf. Hitler didn't want competition. He didn't want people worshiping God or Jesus more than they were worshiping him. Of course, he starts to see himself as all powerful. Hitler, for his own account, Hitler was actually a non-believer. He was an atheist, but he, like Machiavelli said, he used religion to his benefit. He wanted to give the appearance that he was faithful, a faithful German, and use that church affiliation to his advantage. It was also a way to further attack Jewish people and other religious minorities. Schools were also brought under Nazi control as teachers were fired, and then Nazi officials were hired to teach school. They were teaching Nazi propaganda, of course. Things like social Darwinism were taught as factual science. He creates the Hitler Jugend, or the Hitler Youth, for young Nazi boys, and the Bund Deutscher Modell, that's the German Girls Association. So these were sort of like scout troops that were meant to train young German boys and girls to be good future Nazis. And also, very similar to Mussolini in Italy, there's a big influence of Nazi ideas on working women. At first, women of Germany were told to leave the factory and go home and have as many babies as possible, and women were rewarded for having many, many children. Once the war started and the men were needed at the front, women were told to go back and work in the factories, and that was to be their duty to the German state. Also, in the Nazi state, of course, one thing that many people think of when they think of the Nazis is the anti-Semitism. Very strong anti-Semitism. This is actually one of his main priorities. One of the first things Hitler does when he comes to power, besides stripping Jews of their right to serve in the civil service, is that he then passes the Nuremberg Laws in 1935. And these laws are similar to the Jim Crow laws of the South in the United States, in that they prohibited Jewish people from marrying non-Jews. Jews were not allowed to practice law or medicine. Non-Jews were not allowed to shop in Jewish shops. They were not allowed to teach in school. Their businesses were boycotted. And of course, the most famous of the Nuremberg laws is that Jews were then forced to wear a yellow star to identify them as Jewish. Now, what would happen? Many people ask me, well, why didn't they just refuse to wear it? Well, one thing is that the Nazis were really good at record keeping, and they kept a lot of paperwork, and also the registration was already there. Back in those days, you had to register yourself. Your birthplace, your last name, your religion, all of those things would be placed on your official identification records. So it would have been very easy for German police to track down a Jewish person who was posing as a non-Jewish person. That being said, many people did. Many people did pretend to be non-Jewish. A lot of people ask, well, why didn't the Jewish people just leave Germany at this time? A lot of them did. As many of them as they could did leave Germany, but it's important to note it was also impossible for many people to leave Germany. For one, leaving Germany would have meant leaving behind your country, your family, the only home you had ever known. And a lot of people think that that is a very, it's a very daunting thing to have to think about and do, to move halfway across the world to do something like that. Many of them also thought it's not going to get that bad. Jewish people, for the most part, were used to persecution. They just thought this is just a phase. We'll get through it pretty soon. But after Kristallnacht, which was the night of November 9th through the 10th of 1938, the night of broken glass, in which German people all around the country were encouraged to go out and essentially burn down and loot and destroy Jewish homes and synagogues and businesses. Jewish people could not call the police because the police were actually often helping the crowds to destroy their homes and synagogues. This was meant to send a clear message to Jewish people that they were not wanted and nobody would help them. That being said, many Jewish people afterwards did leave or tried to leave Germany, but that didn't mean that they could escape the Nazis. For one, many of them left and went to places like France and Holland or Italy. Um, they went to Russia. Now, those were all places that Hitler would later invade. So no matter where they went, they were not safe because later on Hitler would, invade those countries too. Another thing that the Jews didn't really see coming was that one of the Nuremberg laws that they later passed was that the Germans made it illegal for Jewish people to leave the country with more than $4. So, you try leaving your country with more than $4 in your pocket, see how far you get. So that's one of the things that made it really difficult for Jewish people to leave. So these restrictions on the Jewish people were meant to send them a very clear message of hatred and intolerance. So here is a picture of what that looked like, the anti-Semitism in Germany the night after, or the morning after Kristallnacht, and the very anti-Semitic policies. Okay, so here's your essential questions, guys. A lot of people are obviously fascinated by this topic of how Hitler managed to come to power. Without a doubt, Nazi Germany and everything that the Nazis did is something that will be studied for hundreds, if not thousands of years. And it's something that people live in fear that this may repeat itself one day. Especially because, it does seem like it can happen anywhere. So here's my question to you guys, and I want you to answer in the comments. What do you think Hitler's rise to power teaches us about how democracy can die? We as Americans feel so confident and so assured in our democracy and our form of government because America is the first successful one, I guess you could say. But what exactly does that mean? Does Nazi Germany mean for us? Does it mean that we can give our democracy away too? Can our democracy be as vulnerable as Germany's at times? What does it take for people to give up their constitutional freedoms and look the other way in the face of such tyranny? As a matter of fact, Hitler himself was chosen. He was largely elected. Not all the way. He certainly does some terrible things along the way, but why does Hitler appeal to so many Germans at this time? So with that, guys, I'm going to leave you there, and I will also draw your attention to the reading packet in which you can read Joseph Goebbels' Nazi Propaganda. I highly recommend you read this because he uses a lot of capital words. He's screaming here, as you can see. But he asked the question, why are we nationalists and why are we socialists? Now, it's interesting to note, remember I said the term socialist and nationalist can be very confusing. National Socialist means Nazi. But here he explains what he means by a nationalist, in particular a German nationalist. But interestingly enough, here he talks about what he means by a socialist. When he says, why are we socialists? We are socialists because we see in socialism the only possibility for maintaining our racial existence, and through it, the reconquest of our political freedom and the rebirth of the German state. So in this case, Joseph Goebbels, he interprets socialism in his own way. He interprets socialism as service to and bondage to the state. Some people consider nationalism to be patriotism, but in Nazi Germany, nationalism and socialism, they take on a whole new definition. So it's important to remember that. Another thing that you can read here that I highly recommend is an excerpt from Mein Kampf, from Hitler's autobiography. So it starts here on page 12, and then you'll see here how Hitler connects the Jews, the Marxists, and the German expansion eastward, and how Hitler agreed with Mussolini about various different things. So this is, he's explaining the historical circumstances of Germany, and this gives you some insight into his own point of view right before he takes power. Imagine Hitler writing this from his jail cell, and this will give you some insight into how he was able to get inside the minds of so many German citizens. Okay, guys, tomorrow I'll be talking about Joseph Stalin, not a Nazi, a communist, Hitler's probably biggest enemy besides Britain and the United States, but also a totalitarian leader with a slightly different twist. So let's talk about that tomorrow and how he actually manages to make the Soviet Union into another superpower. I'll see you guys tomorrow. I hope you guys enjoy the rest of your day, and I can't wait to hear your answers in the comments.